Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are cracking open a cold case that's more than 3,000 years old. We're diving into Sigmund Freud's final, and I mean explosive, masterpiece, Moses and Monotheism.
That's an incredible piece of work.
It really is. So here's the mission for this deep dive. We're exploring Freud's bombshell theory. The idea that Moses wasn't actually Jewish but an Egyptian nobleman.
Right.
That he was murdered, actually murdered by his own people in the desert.
A truly shocking claim.
And maybe the biggest of all, that the very concept of one God, monotheism itself, is not some divine revelation. It's the result of a repressed psychological trauma. A ghost, really, returning to haunt humanity.
It's a detective story where history is the crime scene.
And the victim is God. It's a fascinating collision of worlds, isn't it?
It is. I mean, you have Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, writing this while he's literally fleeing the Nazis in 1938.
Wow.
And he's turning his gaze from the individual patient on the couch, and he's applying his entire toolkit to human civilization itself. He is psychoanalyzing the Bible.
So we're not just looking at theology here.
No, not at all. We're exploring the tension between a father figure, the guilt of the sons, and the core atheistic argument that maybe religion is a kind of collective neurosis.
A ghost story we've been telling ourselves for millennia.
Exactly.
It's heavy stuff, for sure, controversial, but I promise you it's absolutely gripping. Before we start unraveling the identity of Moses, I just have a quick request.
Sure.
If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really, really helps us keep these deep dives going.
It does.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Freud starts his argument not with psychology, but with linguistics, of all things.
Right, he puts his detective hat on from page 1.
We all know Moses as the ultimate Hebrew hero, the liberator, but Freud just looks at the name Moses and says, wait a minute.
He says, hold on, that doesn't sound Hebrew to me.
Yeah.
The name Moses or Moses.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre if you try to force a Hebrew origin onto it.
The Bible says it means drawn from the water.
And Freud argues that's just a clumsy piece of folk etymology. You know, a story invented much later to hide the truth.
So if it's not Hebrew, what is it?
It's Egyptian, pure and simple. The word mos in ancient Egyptian just means child.
Just child.
Yes, you see it in the names of the great pharaohs. Thutmose is child of Thoth. Ramesses is Ramos, the child of Ra.
Ah, I see.
So Freud suggests that Moses' name was probably a full Egyptian name originally, something like Taros. And over time, the divine part, the name of the god, it got dropped, leaving just Mos.
So his very name marks him as an outsider.
From the very beginning.
That is wild. It's like finding out a founding father was secretly named Pierre. But okay, he doesn't stop at the name. He goes right for the central myth of his childhood.
The baby in the basket.
The basket in the Nile, yeah.
Yes, and to deconstruct this, he uses the work of Otto Rank, who wrote The Myth of the Birth of the Hero.
Okay.
Rank analyzed myths from all over the world, Sargon, Cyrus, Romulus, Oedipus, and he found this universal pattern.
A kind of algorithm for hero stories.
Precisely. In almost all of them, the hero is born to high status, usually royalty. But there's a danger, so the baby is exposed, often in a box or a basket in the water.
Right.
Then the baby is saved by low people peasants or shepherds. He's raised in obscurity, and then he finally returns to reclaim his royal birthright.
It's the classic hero's journey. Born high, raised low, returns to high. Luke Skywalker, King Arthur, you see it everywhere.
You do. But Freud notices a huge anomaly with the Moses story. It's the exact inversion of this pattern.
An inversion? How?
Well, think about the trajectory. Moses is born low, a Jewish Levite from a slave class. And he's saved and raised high by the Egyptian princess in the palace.
Oh, wow. It's completely backward.
It's flipped 180 degrees. And in psychoanalysis, Freud argues that when a myth does that, it's a defense mechanism. It's hiding something.
Hiding a truth.
Yes. So Freud deduces that the royal family was actually his real family. He wasn't a Jew pretending to be a prince. He was an Egyptian noble. The legend was rewritten to make him acceptable as a national hero.
So the basket story is a complete fabrication to hide that he was one of the ruling elite.
Precisely. He was an Egyptian who chose the Jews, not a Jew discovered by Egyptians.
Which just brings up the massive question, why? Why on earth would an Egyptian nobleman, someone with power and status, just grab a group of Semitic slaves and march them into the wilderness?
What's the motive?
Yeah, what's the motive for a man of the palace to become a refugee leader?
And that is the central mystery. To understand it, we have to look at the religious chaos happening in Egypt at that exact moment. We need to talk about Pharaoh Akhenaten.
Akhenaten,
Yeah.
the heretic king, the one who tried to flip Egyptian religion on its head.
The radical of radicals.
Around 1375 BC, Amenhotep the becomes pharaoh, and he does something just unprecedented. He rejects the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods.
All of them. Amun, Osiris, Isis.
All of them. The animal-headed gods, the magic spells, he threw it all out. And he established the first strict monotheism in human history. He worshipped the sun disk, the Aton, as the sole creator. He even changed his name, right, to Akhenaten.
Spirit of the Aton, yes. And Freud says this is the connection. He argues that the Aton religion was the direct prototype for Jewish monotheism.
And the parallels are there.
They're undeniable. The Aton religion was abstract. Akhenaten banned graven images. No statues, no idols.
Okay, that sounds familiar.
He rejected magic, sorcery, the obsession with the afterlife, the whole cult of Osiris. It was a religion focused on a truth and justice and one universal, formless energy.
That sounds almost exactly like the Mosaic Law. No idols, no magic, focus on justice. It's the 10 Commandments before they existed.
And that is Freud's smoking gun. Because when Akhenaten died, there was a violent counter-revolution. The priests of Amun came roaring back.
And they erased him.
Completely. Smashed his temples, outlawed the Aton faith. It was a total purge.
So where does Moses fit in, a survivor of the purge?
That's Freud's speculation, that Moses was a high-ranking official in Akhenaten's court, a true believer. When the religion fell, his world collapsed.
A man with a creed but no country.
So, in his disappointment, he turns to a group of foreign workers, the Jews, and decides to preserve his religion through them. He sought a new people to carry the torch.
So the Exodus wasn't just an escape from slavery.
It was a religious mission, to save a dying idea. Moses is essentially transplanting this high-minded Egyptian philosophy onto a group of tribesmen.
And Freud points to physical evidence for this, right?
He does. Circumcision. Ancient historians like Herodotus tell us it was strictly an Egyptian custom, mainly for priests, to mark their purity.
The Semitic tribes didn't do it.
Not originally. Freud argues Moses forced this Egyptian custom on the Jews to mark them as holy, to make them into his own private order of Aton priests.
You have this Egyptian aristocrat leading these primitive tribes, imposing this incredibly intellectual, abstract religion on them. That sounds like
Incredibly volatile.
a massive clash of cultures in the middle of a desert.
Volatile is an understatement. And this brings us to the darkest part of Freud's theory. This Egyptian Moses was strict, imperious, demanding.
The religion was just too difficult.
Too spiritual for a people used to tangible idols and simple magic. Imagine telling people struggling to survive, they can't have images, they can't use magic to heal, they just have to follow these abstract laws. Conflict was inevitable.
And here's where it gets really shocking. Freud says they didn't just complain. They didn't just build a golden calf.
Yeah. They killed him.
They actually killed him.
Yes. Freud relies on something called the Selin hypothesis, based on interpretations of the prophet Hosea. The theory is that the Jews finally rebelled against Moses' overbearing authority and murdered him in the wilderness.
They killed the father figure.
They killed the father.
Yeah.
And then they tried to bury the memory.
This is where it becomes a psychological thriller.
It does. After the murder, the group wanders on and eventually merges with other tribes at a place called Kadesh. And these tribes worshipped a completely different god,
Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Wait, I thought Yahweh was the god of Moses.
In the Bible, they're the same. But Freud argues they were originally two totally different deities. Yahweh wasn't an abstract, universal god of truth like the Aton.
What was he then?
He was a local volcano god, a storm god from Midian, fierce, violent, bloodthirsty, a god of fire and destruction.
So you have these two totally different concepts. The ethical abstract god of the Egyptian Moses.
The Aton, yes.
And this violent local volcano god, Yahweh. How do they become one?
Through a historical compromise, a cover-up. The followers of the Egyptian Moses carrying this heavy secret of the murder merged with the Yahweh worshippers.
To hide the crime.
And the gap in time. The scribes and priests eventually fused the two figures. They took the Egyptian noble and the Midianite priest and combined them into the single biblical Moses.
It's a massive historical repression.
Yes, they accepted the name Yahweh, but over time they slowly began to project the character of the Egyptian god justice, universality onto him. But the deed itself, the murder of the original Moses, was pushed down into the collective unconscious.
And this is where we really have to get into the psychology of it all. Freud's idea of God and atheism, he brings in this concept of the latency period.
Right. This is the core of his atheistic critique.
Yeah.
In individual psychology, think of a childhood trauma.
Okay.
A child experiences something terrible at, say, age 5. They might repress it. There's a latency period where everything seems fine. But then later in life, the repressed memory returns, often as neurotic symptoms, anxiety, obsession, guilt.
Even if they don't consciously remember the event.
Exactly. And Freud says this exact process happened to the entire Jewish people.
So walk us through the timeline of this collective neurosis.
Okay. Step 1, the early trauma. The murder of the primal father, Moses. Step 2, defense and repression. The deed is denied, forgotten. They turn to the easier God, Yahweh.
Step 3.
The latency period. This lasts for centuries. The pure religion of Moses just sleeps in the background.
And then step 4, the return.
The return of the repressed. Centuries later, the great prophets arise. Isaiah, Amos, Jeremiah. And what do they preach?
Not the volcano god.
Not at all. They start preaching about a universal God of justice, a God who demands ethical purity. Freud argues this is the return of the Egyptian Moses. The memory of the father they killed comes back to haunt them, but now that memory is elevated to the status of God.
This is such a fascinating take on atheism. It's not just God isn't real. It's that God is a psychological projection of guilt.
Precisely. Freud argues the concept of God is always a projection of the father figure. But in this case, a murdered father. The Jews felt this perpetual, unconscious need for atonement.
They felt chosen by the father, but also cursed by their crime against him.
Yes. And this explains the unique intensity of the religion. The guilt from the murder transforms into an obsession with following the law, with moral perfectionism, with this constant expectation of punishment.
So the strict adherence to the law isn't just devotion. It's an attempt to make up for a crime they don't even remember committing.
That is Freud's central thesis. The power of the one God comes from the power of a repressed memory. It's the ghost of the man they killed returning to demand the obedience they refused him when he was alive.
That is unbelievably heavy. But it leads us right into how Freud then sees Christianity. If Judaism is about the repressed guilt,
Then Christianity is the attempt to solve it.
right, the source talks about Paul of Tarsus. Freud thinks Paul figured this out subconsciously.
He gives Paul a lot of credit for psychological insight. Paul, he thinks, grasped the unconscious truth that was tormenting his people. We are unhappy because we killed the father.
But Paul didn't say Moses, he said God.
Correct. He elevated the crime to the metaphysical level. Original sin is basically the code word for the murder of the primal father. And how do you atone for a life taken?
You give another life, the crucifixion.
The crucifixion. The Son, Jesus, sacrifices himself to atone for the guilt of killing the father. And by doing so, the Son takes the father's place.
So Judaism is a father religion, stuck in guilt. And Christianity becomes a son religion, where the son supersedes the father.
Exactly. But Freud, always the critic, points out a huge regression here. He argues that while Christianity solved the guilt problem, it abandoned the strict intellectual monotheism of the Egyptian Moses.
How so? It's still monotheism, isn't it?
On the surface. But look at the rituals. Christianity brought back communion, the consumption of flesh and blood, which Freud links to ancient totem feasts where you eat the father figure.
Okay.
It brought back the mother goddess and Mary. It embraced miracles, saints, relics, all the superstitions the Aden religion had banned. Freud says that in many ways Christianity was a victory for the priests of Amun over the god of Akhenaten.
A step back toward magic to appeal to the masses.
A step back. It's this battle between pure intellectual thought and emotional comfort.
And that tension brings us to the final and probably most controversial part, the roots of anti-Semitism.
Why this persistent, irrational hatred? For Freud, it's not economics. It's deeply unconscious.
He identifies a few things, right?
Yes. First, simple sibling rivalry. The Jews claim to be the firstborn, the favorite child of the Father God. And other nations are, unconsciously, jealous.
Like Joseph's brothers hating him for his coat.
Exactly. But there's a darker reason. Freud suggests many Christian nations were badly baptized, forced into it. Underneath, they remained barbarians who secretly hated this new, demanding, ethical God.
So they weren't really believers deep down.
He argues they couldn't hate Jesus or the church openly, so they projected their hatred onto the source. They hated the Jews because the Jews started it. They brought this burden of monotheism into the world.
So by hating the Jews, they're unconsciously rebelling against the Father God.
And the restrictions of civilization,
Yeah.
yes. And then there's the castration complex. He argues that circumcision reminds the unconscious of the dread of castration, a symbol of absolute submission to the Father's will. It triggers a visceral fear and revulsion.
So let's zoom out. We've gone from Egyptian linguistics to murder to collective guilt. It feels like Freud is stripping all the magic out of religion and just replacing it with trauma.
He absolutely is. If you look at the big picture, Freud is telling us that religion is about trauma. He's arguing the one God isn't a metaphysical truth, it's a memory.
The ghost of a murdered leader, an Egyptian who tried to force people to live by a standard that was too high.
And because they couldn't, they killed him. And because they killed him, they loved him even more after he was gone. It's the ultimate human tragedy. We reject the truth teller when he's alive, and we worship him when he's dead.
The power of the faith comes from the fact that it's built on a real historical tragedy.
It has the weight of reality behind it, the reality of a crime and a guilt that refused to die.
It definitely changes how you read the Bible. You're not just reading a story, you're reading a cover-up.
A cover-up that created a civilization. And that raises a really important question for us today, doesn't it?
It does.
If the power of God is really just the power of a repressed memory returning from the darkness, what happens if we psychoanalyze it away? Freud was an atheist. He thought this would free us. But you have to wonder, if we strip away the guilt and the trauma, do we lose the ethics and the drive for justice that came with it?
If the one God is just the shadow of a murdered father, what's left when the shadow disappears?
That's the question.
That is a thought that will keep me up tonight. We've traveled from the Nile to the subconscious, and I don't think I'll ever look at Moses or Freud the same way again.
I want to thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
It certainly has.
Think about those truths hiding in your own forgotten history. Until next time, keep thinking deeper.